Hello, my name's Sara Sheridan and I'm a writer and an activist. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of my projects. In 2016, TV historian Bethany Hughes conducted a survey of archive material in England and concluded that only 0.5% of our historical resources are female. Now, I knew that figure was low. I've spent years in archives and other collections muttering, "Where are the women?" under my breath. But I didn't know the level of material was that low. Bethany's study was one of the reasons I decided to write a book, and it's called Where Are the Women? Where Are the Women's an imagined guidebook to Scotland, and the country it conjures regenders our landscape and thus our history towards the story of women rather than men. I first gave this talk in the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, and I love that gallery. I go in and find myself surrounded by images of women, most of whom are named. Our environment beyond those walls, both our built environment and our landscape, contains far fewer women, and the majority of those represented are nameless. In Edinburgh, we have only 3 named statues of women in the city centre, all royal. Queen Victoria on top of the National Gallery on the Mound. 15% of the UK's statues are female, and almost all of those are to Victoria. She loved a statue. 2 Mary Queen of Scots's, one on the Scott Monument on Princes Street and one on the facade of the National Portrait Gallery. By contrast, we have far more named animals represented in the same space and countless numbers of named men. In a recent survey by Historic Environment Scotland, it was revealed that there are more plaques in Scotland to objects than there are to the achievements of women. So when I started writing Where Are the Women, I wasn't absolutely sure I would find enough women who could merit monuments. I didn't know if it was possible to cover the country in female history in the same way as male. In the end, I turned up around 5,000 biographies, and 1,200 of them ended up in the book. And I'm still researching amazing female stories. People send them to me now. The news I come back with from this is good. Our grannies and great-grannies are amazing. We've simply forgotten their achievements. They were scientists and diplomats, artists, writers, warriors, musicians in all eras, as well as victims, witches and women who suffered because of the Highland clearances, Jacobite women who were raped by the Duke of Cumberland's men as part of his campaign to suppress the Highland counties after Culloden. There are also some real baddies, swindlers and murderers, and my favourite baddie, the Duchess of Sutherland, who was a key architect of the Highland clearances and who is mentioned in memoriam on a urinal in a pub in Partick, where many of the displaced Highlanders ended up. Pay your respects here, it says. In the book, I wanted to create a female version of the world around us, a Scotland where the cave on Staffa is named after Malvina rather than Fingal, and Arthur's seat isn't Arthur's but belongs to St Tridwana, where you arrive into Dundee at Slessor Station, and the Victorian monument on Stirling's Abbey Hill interprets national identity not as a male warrior, but through the pioneering women who ran hospitals during World War I. The West Highland Way ends at Fort Mary. The Old Lady of Hoy is a prominent Orkney landmark, and St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh proudly displays statues of the suffragettes rather than a late 18th century column, phallic symbol, upon which Lord Dundas, a proponent of the slave trade who was impeached for financial impropriety, is erected. In commemorating women, I imagined many different kinds of monument. The traditional statue, but also places of pilgrimage for public engagement, festivals and light installations, murals, parks, altars, benches, cairns, fountains and bells, and perfume. And I want to talk a little bit more about perfume now, because for me and for many readers I've found perfume is the most evocative sense. A whiff of a smell from our childhood can transport us back to where we came from, a grandmother's front room, or a mother dressed up to go out. It's an immediate form of memory, a time machine of sorts, and so it seemed to me a creative and relevant way to memorialise the myriad achievements of our forerunners. So I did. In real life, in 2016, I co-launched a perfume company with my daughter called Reek. Reek was all about commemorating women. When the book was only a twinkle in my eye, it was the genesis, if you like, of me becoming a very smelly feminist. It started with one scent, in memory of the Jacobite women. We chose the Jacobites because they have such great stories, and there's so much about where modern Scotland comes from. Jacobitism versus Hanoverianism was the key political debate of the Enlightenment era in the city, not even a mile from where I live. Because the Jacobites lost that argument, we don't commemorate them. In fact, just about the only place they are commemorated is in the National Portrait Gallery. They have a whole room of Stuart portraits upstairs. My favourite Jacobite woman is Lady Winifred Maxwell. When the Old Pretender lost the 1715 uprising, Winifred's husband, the Earl of Nithsdale, was condemned to death and held in the Tower of London. Winifred pleaded for his life but got nowhere with King George. She decided to save her husband anyway, so she visited him on his last night in the Tower with several of her ladies. The women smuggled in a dress, and then leaving one by one, they smuggled out the Earl of Nithsdale in drag. Just an extra woman. He had a beard, and it's said he made it out of the building by holding a handkerchief up to his face, pretending to cry at the fate of the poor man in the prison cell. Winifred, in a feat of heroism comparable to women working behind Nazi lines in World War II, in my view, stayed in his cell pretending to talk to him while he set out initially to London and then to the south coast of England and the safety of France. And she did it. She got away. She followed him. They went to Italy, and she remains the only woman, as far as I'm aware, to orchestrate a successful jailbreak from the Tower of London. She was extraordinary, and she is uncommemorated. The Hanoverian press hated the Jacobite women. Like the tabloids today, they did not pull their punches when they felt women had stepped out of line, and they called them all kinds of horrible names. The perfume we mixed is called Damn Rebel Bitches, which they were called. If you're interested in finding out more about the Jacobite women, I'd recommend Maggie Craig's book of the same name. And of course, I put up some statues to them and told some of their stories in Where Are the Women too. Now, the reason I wanted to make that scent is because scent is a silent rebellion, and silent rebellion is something at which women can excel. By spraying on the scent, you could commemorate the real history and also take on the mantle of the Damn Rebel Bitches. You could become part of their story. You could channel their spirit. And you knew, but nobody else needed to know that you were doing that. So for me, it was important that the smell, therefore, was genuine. So how do you mix a scent that captures history? I drove our perfumer, the award-winning independent Sarah McCartney, crazy. The scent had to not smell of an actual Jacobite woman, but be kind of redolent of their life. So Sarah chose in the end blood orange because the new trade of marmalade making was up and coming in women's lives at the time. Malt, because women were brewers. Clary sage, which was a flower used in women's medicine at the time. Pink peppercorns, which were a very expensive luxury in the kitchen in the era. And hazelnut, a big part of the Highland diet. We mixed 100 bottles and we launched in August 2016. We were told we might sell our initial 100 by the end of Christmas, but we sold a lot in the first month. It turned out there was a lot of Damn Rebel Bitches out there. And I think that, like me, many women are bored to tears of being sold products that represent us as young and sexy and smelling of some kind of flower. It's an old-fashioned notion that art outgrew more than a century ago. And you see that actually in the gallery on the walls. Women's bodies are sanitised in early portraiture. The vogue for hairless Georgian and Victorian nudes who look like statues, moving in the early 20th century into actual representations of women's bodies, the way we really are. Modern day marketing images are very far behind on this curve. After Bitches, a scent in solidarity with the witches followed. Scotland has the worst witch hunts in Europe. 2,500 people per million of population died, rather than 500 per million in most countries. And again, there's no real monument to what these women suffered, although a campaign to do that and to pardon the women who were convicted of this has been launched since. And that sense, the women's scent, actually, we wanted to make it smell of outdoors and of burning and of healing. And in fact, the witch's scent became beauty editor's pick in Elle UK and in Grazia, and was also featured in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. The beauty press were really interested in what we did at Reek, not only because of the compelling history, but because the images that we created to tell that story. Many of the historic portraits in galleries are essentially a form of advertising for an influential family or for a political cause. It's kind of branding, particularly very early ones, and all the ones upstairs that I mentioned before, all the ones of the Stuarts in the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh would fall into that category. And image continues important. So when we came to make images for Reek, we did so with a feminist objective. Traditional marketing materials for perfume feature predominantly size 6 to 8 photoshopped young white women. And we used those women as well as models, but our remit was a lot wider. So our oldest model was 80, our largest model was a size 22. We celebrated all kinds of beauty at Reek, and we didn't retouch the images at all. Now, the internet hates this. If you don't retouch images of skin, and perfume images are all about skin, what you're doing is classified as pornography. So doing it was crazy, it was mad. Your images, we knew our images would be blocked, and we did it anyway. So added to that, our keywords were reclaiming the provinces of witches and bitches, and so you can imagine how much of a stir our images made amongst both bots and trolls. And by the end of Reek's life, we were shadow blocked on Facebook, basically for not using images of young white women and then photoshopping them to unrealistic levels. However, for us, it was really important to make that stand. And more, we started a blog called Bitches Unite, which is a pan-feminist platform, gave our models a voice along with a whole load of other women. We interviewed our models about what it's like to be photographed, what their interests and passions were, their favourite political campaigns. The truth is, for centuries, as evidenced by many of the portraits and almost all the built environment around us, it's okay to show images of women, but not specific women, and not women with a voice. As Professor Mary Beard said in her book, Women and Power, Western society is extremely accomplished at silencing women. Coming back to my book, Where Are the Women was inspired by a project in The New Yorker by all-round feminist shero Rebecca Solnit. Now in 2016, as we were launching Reek, Rebecca remapped the New York subway. All roughly 40 odd stops are really named after men, and she renamed them after women instead. So in the introduction to her project, Solnit points out that New York's most prominent statue is a nameless woman, a nobody, the Statue of Liberty. This symbol in female form is like so many around the world, around our city too, representing justice or peace. The statue of Gladstone in Edinburgh in the West End on Coates Crescent actually shows more women than men. Gladstone himself sits atop 6 full-sized images of virtues that are represented in female form. But the women have no words, no real names. They are faceless, nameless symbols. So I was inspired by what Rebecca did, and my book owes everything to her. It's just that I got ridiculously ambitious and repeated the project for a whole country. Beware being inspired by writers, especially if you like writing books, you end up with a huge workload. One of the main comments made by readers of Where Are the Women after it came out last May was that the stories in the book both inspired them and made them angry. Why had we not heard of so many of these women before? And worse, why hadn't we noticed the extent to which the world around us is gendered? Not only in pay gaps and societal norms, but the actual world, the hills and woods and street names and parks. And the answer to this is that it is the essence of misogyny. It's the water we swim in. We don't even notice it. And that's why misogyny still exists, why it's so successful. Once we notice it, in fact, we start making an argument for change. There are big differences in the way we remember women and men and commemorate their achievements. Those differences are literally built into the world around us, and they form our views of what is possible for ourselves, our daughters, and our granddaughters. That's why there is a sense in which the key challenge facing equality activists, and indeed the mission of present-day feminism, is to normalise difference. Women are 50% of the population, but we are still considered a minority. Recently, Caroline Criado Perez's book Invisible Woman has outlined 100 ways in which our society does this, from car crash test dummies being set to the norm of an average man, resulting in car safety being less effective at protecting female bodies, to the degree that women are 17% more likely to die in a car crash, to the way medicines are tested, which result in over 43% higher death rates for women suffering from heart disease. This is not notional. This is life and death. We have to challenge the dominant cultural narrative, which is male, and normalise 50% of the population, us, not only our physical beings, which will help with the car crashes, but women's history of great achievement in education and science and in the arts and in leadership. And we also have to stop being so heteronormative. It's everywhere. One of the most important and interesting things I learned in researching the book was the proximity of our history. I stopped thinking of history as a set of dates and started thinking of it in generations. The suffragettes were 3 mothers ago. The pioneers of women's higher education were 5 mothers ago. Female anti-slavery campaigners were 7 mothers ago. And the Jacobites, my favourites, were 12 mothers ago. Our history is not prim and proper like a Jane Austen adaptation. We come from fighters, women who stood up for what they believed in. We are their daughters and their sons, and we have 2 duties. The first is to commemorate them properly. However we do that, whether you want to secretly smell like a Jacobite woman, we recently sold some perfume to female MPs at Westminster. You can hardly blame them for wanting to stage a silent, smelly rebellion in that chamber. The second is to continue to make change, because societies that don't make changes as they are required to die. Our foremothers knew this. They campaigned militantly for the vote. They changed the laws around rape within marriage and domestic violence, and they secured women's right to education. They were amazing. And we need to tell their stories. And as they change the world for their daughters and sons, we need to change the world for ours. You switch this on to hear about art, I think. But art is only a reflection of our lives. We have been landed a huge legacy, some of the stories of which are told on the walls of our art galleries. We need to live up to that legacy. That's our duty.